Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Jorge Plutzky.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to start off with a simple, impolite question. How old are you? Most of us don't like that question. It's quite charged, but in fact, there's more than one way that you can answer that question. Now, in your personal lives, you may have answered that question in a variety of different ways, but in terms of medicine and biology, there's also different ways that you can answer that question. We can mark time, putting candles on a cake, but in fact, time, when it comes to medicine and to our health, is not something that's constant. It can vary. It can vary for each of us. And our age, and importantly, our biological age, is something different. Our biological age captures our past, even our family genetics and where we came from, but also how we've lived before. It captures our present and how we're living. And importantly, it captures our future. Now, as a preventive cardiologist, I often find myself in the clinic room sitting across from a patient, and I'm trying to predict for them and for myself their future, their risk of the biggest threats that Americans face: heart attack, stroke, and diabetes. And if in fact you are only as old as your arteries, it raises a very fundamental question for us. What determines the biological age of our cardiovascular system? Now, at a place like the Brigham, we spend and have the opportunity to teach physicians locally and nationally and internationally, and we have the chance to teach the best and the brightest who come from all over the United States and the world about medicine. And one of the ways we teach that is by using a case. And I want to share with you a case. It's not an ordinary case. It's actually my favorite case of all time. It's the story of JW. He's a 44-year-old surgeon. He thought he was doing pretty well. Yes, he was overweight and thought he could lose some weight. He, of course, like many people, associated that with getting married and blamed his spouse. He had borderline hypertension, but his blood pressure was checked when he was nervous. He would get nervous when his blood pressure was checked, and his blood pressure was checked after he was on call, or the next day when he was following call, or when he was stressed with cases. His cholesterol was borderline, and he had a touch of diabetes. Now, for a preventive cardiologist, a touch of diabetes is like a touch of pregnancy. You're either pregnant or you're not. JW didn't see it that way. This was his scenario. But JW was something else. He was an avid outdoorsman. He loved to hunt and to fish and go camping, and he loved to do it all by himself. Beyond the human voice and beyond the beeper was how he would put it. And he was on one such trip deep in the heart of the Maine woods all by himself when he began having chest pressure. And it became worse and worse, and he began developing shortness of breath, and a little nausea, and some sweating. And JW, as a physician, knew what was happening. He was having a heart attack, and he was having it in the middle of nowhere. Well, JW survived that heart attack, but without early treatment, it was a massive one, and his heart muscle was severely weakened. And JW, as a physician, was able to look into his crystal ball, and he knew that his future had dramatically changed. He, in fact, had relatively suddenly, biologically aged. And so even before he met me, JW took upon himself intense study to decide how he could change his future, how he could steal back time and perhaps have things not unfold in his crystal ball in the exact same way. And JW came up with 4 things he thought were critical to do in order to change his future. So the first one was that he needed to follow doctor's orders. And that's an easy one for me to agree with. I was behind that. The second one was that he had to reduce stress. And for JW, that meant he wasn't going to operate anymore. He was going to become a medical doctor, and he was going to see patients in the clinic because it was so much less stressful. Now, my medical colleagues and I would argue and say that practicing medicine in a clinic is not a relaxing activity, but JW thought that this would be much better for him, and it was his reality, so we certainly could support the idea of reducing stress. And the third one, which was his major focus, was he thought he needed to lose weight, based upon what he read in his study, that he needed to lose weight. But beyond that, he also needed to not just eat less, he also needed to exercise more and be active as part of this process of losing weight. And this approach by JW is well-founded. We have lots of studies like this that show a direct relationship. As one looks at weight, or we measure it body mass index, you go from left to right, lean, overweight, and obese, and the risk of cardiovascular death. It's quite proportional. It even is more striking if you look at something like diabetes, a very strong relationship between this very potent cardiovascular risk factor. But as JW embarked upon this effort to lose weight, he was taking on a big task. He was taking on the entire universe, because it is a fundamental law in the universe that nothing moves without energy. You can have the fanciest car in Palm Beach, and if you don't put gasoline in it and have something to burn, it's not going to move. It's a paperweight. And in order for me to move across this stage, I'm moving in this universe, I have to have something to burn. I need energy in order to do that simple act. And for a heart to beat, you have to have energy in order to make it move. And so all of you sitting there right now are performing an amazing trick. You're acting as a furnace. You're burning energy. And how do I know that? Well, one, you're warm, and you're warmer than the environment, so you're generating heat. You can't do that without energy. And two, your heart is beating. Hopefully, your heart is beating. And you can't do that in this universe without something to burn. And what's amazing about this science is there are only two things you can burn. There's only two things you can burn to keep your heart pumping or to make your muscles work. One of them is glucose, sugar, and the other one is a fatty acid. And a fatty acid is a family of molecules. They come in different forms, and they're found in different foods, good ones in avocado and olive oil, and bad ones in processed foods. And these molecules are very different. Glucose is much more like paper. And if, unfortunately, you have to leave Palm Beach and return to the frigid north, hopefully before or after the storm, if I told you to heat your house with paper this winter, you'd say it's impossible. We will freeze. But a fatty acid is different. If you put a fatty acid in your furnace, it's not paper. It's more like oak. And if I told you to heat your house in Boston this winter using oak, you wouldn't be scared of freezing. You'd say it's going to be smoky and it's going to be a hassle, and I really don't know why I can't use my heating system, but you know you wouldn't freeze because each oak log, each fatty acid gives off so much energy. As a matter of fact, a fatty acid gives off more than double the energy of a glucose molecule. And for that very simple reason, and this simple biology, these simple chemical properties, and those laws of the universe, for millions of years, we've had a biological imperative where we had to be very careful how we handled this energy because it determines survival. This is how we lived, by careful management of this energy in a world where there wasn't that much energy, and it was very hard to get at energy. And so when it comes to these fatty acids, you had to store them. If you ever had more fatty acids than you needed to burn, you had to store them. Because then, in a scenario where you didn't have enough to eat, you could withdraw from the bank and then burn them. And of course, that bank is fat. That's where we put fatty acids and we store them. And it has been something that's dictated our biology for millions of years. But we come into a modern conundrum because our futures are different than that. Now, you won't have too many doctors tell you that they're going to promise you something and guarantee it to you. But I can promise you and guarantee you something tonight. No one's going to starve to death. But your body doesn't know that. Your body is operating on old software and old programming where it is obsessed and terrified of starvation. And so we go from this scenario that's dictated our biology for so long of energy balance to one in the modern era of energy imbalance. And that's a result of many different forces. we have unprecedented access to energy, which we measure as calories. And the quality of that energy is not nearly as good. And we live in an era where we don't have to burn as much energy in our day-to-day lives. You think about the car, or think about the remote. Who here, I want to ask for a show of hands, has watched a TV show that you didn't want to watch because the remote was on the other side of the room? And was that show about cooking and food? Again, I don't want to know the answers, but in fact, it's something we deal with all the time. Here's an example of that. Here's a hamburger, 1954, 202 calories. Modern day hamburger, 3 times that. So in terms of energy balance, you want to get back to even. So what do you have to do with a 1954 hamburger? You have to walk briskly for about 45 minutes. But for the modern hamburger, you have to walk for close to 4 hours to get back to even. An overload of energy which dictates our lives, and an energy imbalance which drives the modern scourges of diseases we face. Obesity, diabetes, heart disease, we see it all the time in the clinic, in the cardiology wards, throughout the hospital. And these are really best thought of as diseases of energy. And they are diseases that accelerate aging. The processes that are work here accelerate aging. Now, you may not believe me. You may not believe the science, but I know you're going to believe the New York Times. So I want to introduce you to 2 fellows here. This is Owen and Canto. And these are rhesus monkeys. And they're part of a study. Now, Owen is eating 445 calories a day, whereas Canto is eating about double that and being studied. That's the equivalent of human about 2,000 versus 3,000 calories. And it may not look like it, but Owen is actually older than Canto. And when you look at Owen and his biology, he's got better skin and better gait, better strength, better demeanor, more energy. I think you'll agree with me, that's a fine-looking monkey. And let's look at Canto. I'm not going to ask you if Canto reminds you of anyone you know. Please, keep that to yourself. But Canto, in fact, has a lot of the problems that we see in the clinic, and they promote heart disease, like high triglycerides and diabetes. We've come to learn a lot more what happens with this energy excess. It tends to end up in a particular kind of fat called visceral fat, around the waist, deep in the organs. And this kind of fat drives higher levels of glucose and fatty acids in the bloodstream, drives inflammation, processes we know through work at the Brigham and elsewhere that promotes cardiovascular disease, and molecules that accelerate aging. And we've also come to learn that there are different kinds of fat. There's white fat, where we store energy, saving it for a rainy day, putting those fatty acids in there and releasing them when forced. But there's another kind of fat, brown fat. And brown fat's completely different. It doesn't store energy, it releases it as heat. And we know that with too much time in this kind of position, that you'll end up with a lot of white fat and visceral fat. We've known for some time that bears have brown fat. That's how they get through the winter, releasing heat and protecting themselves while they're hibernating. And we've come to learn that babies have brown fat. And why? Because they have a tremendous amount of surface volume for a very little area. They're radiating heat. And if you go back thousands of years where we didn't have all the protections against the environment that we have now, that was a survival approach for babies. But one of the new findings from our group and others is that some adult humans have brown fat as well. And it can be variable, associated with thinness, and can be induced by a variety of different activities and different approaches. And so that one becomes very interested in the idea, is there a switch where we could turn our dangerous white fat into brown fat? And in fact, my laboratory has found one such switch that we're very interested in continuing to pursue. Here are 2 mice that are identical. But this mouse on the right, we've removed one gene. And both mice are now on a high-fat diet. And so now you understand this like a physician, a scientist would. You say, looking at these 2 mice, this mouse on the right can only be this skinny in 2 ways in terms of energy balance. It can run around the cage more and burn that energy off, or it could eat less. This mouse has another trick that almost defies the universe. It eats the same and it drinks the same. It releases its energy as heat. It converts its white fat to brown fat, literally melting those banks of fatty acids to stay lean. And what happens as a result? Of course, the obese mouse gets obesity and diabetes, but the experimental one is completely protected against these very common problems. And it's pointing us in a direction to understanding these forces and maybe how we can tackle them and address them to decrease dangerous fat and perhaps approach other fat that might be more beneficial. Now, I want to come back to JW and tell you what happened with this four-step program he took to try and take on his issues. Well, he was incredibly successful. He lost over 140 pounds during 2 years by following this kind of program. He had no further diabetes, it disappeared. And his parameters, like blood pressure and his lipids, got even better than normal. His cholesterol improved, got even better than normal. And JW would like to point out that a lot of this happened with the first 10 or 15 pounds he lost, which is important for us to know that we don't all have to lose 140 pounds. We don't all need to lose 140 pounds. Small changes do make a big difference. And importantly, JW had no further cardiovascular events. He did exceptionally well and never had another event. This is what's truly amazing about JW and has had us thinking about him for a very long time. His heart attack happened in 1950, and I met him when he was 98. His heart attack happened in 1950. I met him when he was 98. JW and Owen and even Canto have a lot to tell us. We have a lot to learn from them. And we've been able to learn a great deal and will continue to learn a great deal from the science that's being pursued at the Brigham, uncovering these pathways. We have an unprecedented ability to identify risk factors, predict future events, and intervene on issues like cholesterol and diabetes and lipids and heart disease. But together, they're all telling us about how we can defy our age, how we can defy the age we live in, and in so doing, chart a new cardiovascular destiny. Thank you.